So are things now getting less transparent in Alberta when it comes to how your tax dollars are being spent? Plus, as we await signs that Ottawa is prepared to take big, bold policy swings, new survey results show that Canadians are hungry for decisive action on the economy. All that and more straight ahead in episode 24 of The Rob Breakenridge Show. Hey folks, thanks for joining us here on The Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. A lot of ground to cover on this episode, including some updates on some stories we've been following and discussing as of late on this program. We will also hear today from the Business Council of Alberta. They've been calling on Ottawa to get serious about bold economic policy. They've got some new polling to back that up as Canadians seem eager to see Ottawa think and act big. That's coming up shortly. Off the top, though, some important stories concerning how your tax dollars are being spent by the Alberta government and the extent to which citizens and taxpayers are able to track and monitor that. It was revealed this week that on the Friday before the August long weekend, a change was made to the rules on how the provincial government discloses expense claims made by cabinet ministers and senior government officials. This new policy ends the practice of proactively disclosing and releasing receipts for expenses over $100. The government has also removed years' worth of these expense reports that have previously been publicly available on the government website. So we've got that story, which, by the way, may still be an evolving story, plus the release this week of the latest gas tax honesty report and other conversations to be had about the direction of taxes, spending, and debt in Alberta. Joining us now to unpack and analyze it all, very pleased to be joined by Kris Sims, Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, taxpayer.com. Kris, so great to have you with us here.
Thank you so much for including us. We appreciate it.
Okay, so let's get into this expense story. This is an interesting one because I guess the decision was made a couple of weeks ago. We just kind of learned about it this week, but it sounds like maybe there's been some movement. Let's just kind of go back to the beginning. What is it we're talking about here? This is the disclosure of expense reports, receipts specifically involving, I guess, cabinet ministers, government officials?
Yes. So this goes way back to 2012 when folks here in Alberta might remember there was an expense scandal where the MLA, then with the PCs, Thomas Lukaszuk, had gone overseas. And however it happened, they wound up with having a $20,000 cell phone bill. And so people didn't like that very much, which is understandable because it was taxpayers' money, etc. So a big push was made for radical transparency, for full transparency from the government, meaning they would proactively post their expense receipts, which are itemized, so you can see what they're buying with your money on the internet. Now, every MLA doesn't need to tweet it out every time they buy something, but they give it to their staff. The staff gives it to the proper people, and it is proactively disclosed online, meaning you don't need to pay an FOI fee. You don't have to wait months and months to maybe never get the documents. This has been the case now, full transparency since 2012. It's a super good thing, keeps everybody playing by the same rules and keeping them honest. Now, This is where the weird part comes in. And I actually am stumped. I don't know why the government would make this super dumb move. On Friday, August 1st, the Friday before the long weekend, the government quietly changed the policy so that now they're not going to be proactively posting the receipts for all of us to see. They wanted to put them behind an FOI paywall. And good luck getting it out of them, right? Because anyone who's worked with FOI, you can wait forever for things like that. And you need to pay for it every single time. And so we're less than pleased about this. And so we fired it up and said, this can't happen. You have to reverse it. What's interesting now is that I'm hearing three things. One, I'm hearing the premier was out of town when this happened on August 1st. I'm hearing that people at the top of the government food chain are unhappy with what has happened. And this is the important part for taxpayers, that this is going to be reviewed at the cabinet meeting before this is implemented. So I'm hoping that this means they're climbing down fast.
Yeah, let's hope so. And I think that's why it's important to focus on these stories. And sometimes when there is that blowback that can prompt a rethink on government. There's one interesting aspect to this, too, because you're talking about the timeline. So 2012 to now is 13 years. The rule government's going by is that these documents need to be there for 5 years, but they've made it sort of a 5-year maximum. So it sounds like these now only go back 5 years. And I guess everything from 2012 to 2020 is now gone.
Yeah, it better not be gone. They better have just unplugged some of their hard drives or however they store this data. So we heard two excuses. I'll just give you a bit more of the inside baseball. So I heard about this on Monday morning, early. So I'm like, what is this? And just frankly, this is so out of step with the government that wants to have, taxpayer protection plan. They like referendums. They like recall legislation. It just wasn't in tune. So I'm like, is this true? So I went through the proper channels and emailed the government media muckety muck person. Nothing. I emailed them before 9 a.m. They got back to me after 7:00 p.m. with an emailed answer with two really lame explanations. One, that they can no longer post receipts on the internet for safety reasons, as if somebody can go back in time and find an MLA who's standing at a car rental counter. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And if you're truly worried about it, just delete the physical street address of the hotel. Like, nobody cares about that. They care about the type of hotel you're staying at and how much money you're spending. And two, the other thing, exactly to your point here, is they said basically, oh, well, we're running out of computer storage for all this really sensitive data. Yeah, that doesn't fly. Does not fly. We insist upon them plugging those things back in. We want access to that data. It's really important to be able to go back in time and look through historical, even expense data, because that's the only way folks can track if the government's getting better or worse. It's the same as the historical table. You've covered tons of budgets. The best sheet in that entire budget document is always the historical budget data over time. So you can track it back to the 1990s, back when New Kids on the Block were popular, and see what we were spending then, compare it to what we're spending now. That's the only way you can track improvement in the government. And so they got to put that data back up there.
Well, that's the thing. And in terms of why this matters, you mentioned the controversy from 2012. We've seen similar controversies at other levels of government in Ottawa, because governments don't come out and tell us that, oh, hey, by the way, we've been abusing the taxpayer purse. It comes out oftentimes through freedom of information requests, right? So having that transparency and that proactiveness to putting this out there, it's a layer of protection for taxpayers, isn't it?
Yeah, this is part of the part that I find a little bit funny. You might too, I don't know, as a journalist. But I've been in the game for a long time, as you have been. And what I found funny is that folks probably remember the $16 glass of orange juice, right? They probably remember, they probably remember the Governor General flying around the world and eating beef carpaccio for $200,000 or $100,000. They remember those things because they're distinctive. They stick in your brain. It's like, oh, right, you were eating that while, I'm trying to afford ground beef. That's cute, right? If it was simply a line item on an expense sheet that said food, it probably wouldn't have made any waves. Further to that, that data was wrenched out of the federal government through an FOI mechanism where we had to wait ages and ages for the information. We even watched bureaucrats fib to our faces at committee saying, we don't have the receipts for the airplane food. It was just normal eggs and stuff. They're gone. The receipts are gone. The Taxpayers Federation, we literally had them at the time. And we're watching these guys at committee going, really? Because we have them right here. It's funny that you don't have copies of them because we got them from you. It makes it such a bigger story. If you make a journalist, especially an independent journalist, put in the legwork of fees and waiting and back and forth and appeals to wrench a receipt of taxpayers' money out of the government, now you've got yourself an exclusive. Now you've got yourself a big story. If they just routinely post it on the internet, it's like, oh, well, that was publicly available information. So what? Now, it could still be a big deal. If you go find it and it's already proactively disclosed, that doesn't make it not a big deal. But in the grand flow of things, it doesn't attract as much attention. So again, this is shooting themselves in the foot. Like, there's no upside to this from a comms perspective, from a transparency perspective. It looks stinky. Like, this makes no sense. I'm truly quite baffled.
Well, as you say, I mean, hopefully it's an evolving story. We'll see if we get some changes or reversal in the coming days. Let's talk about the announcement Thursday, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation releasing the annual gas tax honesty report, and looking specifically too at Alberta, Kris. We do see, I guess, right across the country pretty much, the federal consumer carbon tax. That's no longer a part of what we're paying for gasoline. So what's new or what's different in 2025 here?
So often at the Taxpayers Federation, I have to deliver bad news. And so I'm actually using this Gas Tax Honesty Day to deliver some good news and to legit say thank you to people who are in the media, who are everyday taxpayers, who would not let up on this carbon tax fight. You probably remember back when Aaron O'Toole was the leader of the Conservative Party, and he broke that huge pledge that he made with us years ago and said, you know what, we're going to have a carbon tax too. The headline in the Globe and Mail just a couple of years ago was basically, this issue is dead. The carbon tax is here to stay. Basically, shut up and pay it. Suck it up. It's over. Guess it wasn't. Yeah. Because even the federal Liberals had to finally listen to the normal people out there and say, you know what, this is a huge cash grab. It's not reducing emissions. You're just punishing the working class and the working poor. We have to scrap this thing. And they did. And I'm thrilled because I went back and I've been with the CTF for a long time, and it was just a tangible example. I went back and I was using my news release from last summer as a template. So I got all my formatting right. Gas is like 20 cents cheaper now at the pump.
Wow.
We are saving, truckers are saving $200 per fill up on average with diesel, just with this carbon tax gone. Pickup truck, $20 you folks are saving every time you're filling up. Family minivan, that's $13 off every time. I can get a roast chicken for that from the grocery store. That's serious money back into people's pockets. And it's so rare that we get these really tangible victories. I'm just super proud of people where they were called climate deniers and said they wanted to burn the country down for going on a family road trip. The level of dumb coming out of the federal government on this issue reached epic proportions. And they were name calling. People just blinked and walked through the fire. It was amazing. And now it's gone. So I'm just so thrilled. So I'm just taking this report day as a victory. Yes, we still have gas taxes. Yes, we know the industrial carbon tax is coming. But for this day in August, we're just wanted to say thank you to everybody for pushing back, because now that's why you have cheaper prices at the gas pump.
I mean, it was funny. You mentioned last summer, and I remember especially there was the debate in Parliament. The Conservatives were trying to press the government, at least maybe pause it for the summer, give people a break. And the government said, we can't. It won't make a difference anyway. And then fast forward a few months right before the federal election, you got a new prime minister, a different direction. There's all these Liberals and cabinet ministers out filling up their cars, celebrating the end of the carbon tax. It was quite a 180.
Yeah, it was almost surreal. So at the Taxpayers Federation, we specialize in making sure that you can understand what we're saying on mute. So we're there with our gas tax chart. We're in front of a gas pump. We're pointing out how big the gas taxes are. We'll often have a jerry can. I often would have done videos, pumping gas. I did one last winter back when we still had a carbon tax on my hand. It was super cold. And when you get out and it's too warm and your hand freezes to the pump. So and it was real. And I'm pointing out that not only were we paying at the pumps through the nose, we were being punished for heating our homes in winter in Canada. It was the worst. And so then fast forward exactly to your point, bingo bango, Mark Carney takes over, realizes, I will point this out, that in his opinion, the carbon tax had a communications problem. He loves carbon taxes. He just understood that this fight was over and he had to get rid of the consumer carbon tax. But to their credit, it is gone now. But to your point, I couldn't believe my eyes. Here are these Liberal members of Parliament, the same ones who were standing up saying, you want the planet to burn, along with Mark Holland in the House of Commons, filling up their gas tank. We're saving you $10 a fill up. We're saving you $20 a fill up. Aren't we great? It's amazing what happens. Politics is so interesting, right? Nothing moves until it does, suddenly.
Now, here in Alberta, and I know the government will say, and it's true, I mean, we don't have a sales tax. They've lowered income taxes, so there are other ways the taxpayers are saving. But we still have the 13-cent excise tax. And for a while, that was paused. And I guess technically on the books, we still have this formula, this sliding scale where that tax can adjust depending on the price of oil. But where are things at in Alberta right now on gas taxes?
Great question. So all told, all of the taxes you pay at the pump in Alberta for gasoline are 29 cents per liter. So roughly it's going to cost you over $20 just in taxes every time you fill up, say, a family minivan. So we have got one of the lowest. We're beat, unfortunately, by Manitoba. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew had reduced his fuel tax, and he's made sure to keep it, I think it's half a cent cheaper than it is in Saskatchewan. So it's actually Manitoba, run by an NDP government, I will point out, that has the lowest gasoline taxes in Canada right now. But all told, the total tax bill per liter of gasoline now in Alberta is 29 cents per liter. Yes, we still have that full 13-cent per liter provincial tax. It's like an excise tax, technically. But the good news is we don't have a sales tax. But I wanted to also highlight something of caution here. Alberta has a industrial carbon tax. We should not have any carbon taxes in Canada, like at all. Like in Alberta, if you went and told somebody randomly in Toronto who follows politics, guess which Western province is hanging on to an industrial carbon tax? They probably wouldn't guess Danielle Smith's Alberta. I'm just saying. So Premier Smith has got to take a page out of Scott Moe's playbook and make sure that Alberta is a carbon tax-free province. I know they're going to come back and say they need some formula, blah, 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 with the oil companies. We don't care. We don't care. Get rid of it. Because what this is signaling to Prime Minister Mark Carney is that Albertans are fine with industrial carbon taxes. Her trying to split this hair and say, oh, well, it has to be a provincial industrial carbon tax. We can't take Ottawa's. That is not going to wash. That is not going to wash. I'm surprised, frankly, that it's still here and she's only frozen it. No. Follow what Scott Moe's doing. Say carbon tax-free zone.
We're in an interesting moment in Alberta right now, aren't we? I mean, they did finally follow through on their income tax cut promise. Took a couple of years. But at the same time, I mean, spending's going up. Deficit we're facing right now, potentially. Even the debt is actually going in the wrong direction in Alberta. What do you make of where we're at right now?
So overall, we're doing very well. Like if we compare ourselves to other provinces, we're doing very well. I just went down a rabbit hole the other day online. I couldn't help myself. I started clicking. You know when you start researching something and you're like, what? Oh my goodness, right. What? And so I went down this rabbit hole. I was trying to compare the tax situations for working people in Alberta versus Nova Scotia. So I've actually lived in Nova Scotia. Some of my best friends live there. I have family there. You know, I understand Nova Scotia quite well, especially rural Nova Scotia. But it was still shocking to me how much they're getting screwed, comparatively speaking, on their taxes. Their income taxes are 14% for the first $60,000 worth of earnings. And even then, they don't earn as much. The average income for a working Nova Scotian is around $69,000 or $68,000 per year. In Alberta, it's $84,000 per year, and you're taxed way less, especially now, to your point, good on them. They kept their election promise. Our first $60,000 worth of earnings is now 8% instead of 10%. That you do the apples to oranges comparison on top of us not having a sales tax in Nova Scotia, it's 14% on everything. You walk out the door and you're hit in the face with a 14% combined HST. So compared to other provinces, we're doing well. Democratically speaking, we're the head of the class because we can have referendums. We have recall legislation at the provincial, municipal, and school board level. I will remind people as we're coming up to the elections, you can fire your school board if you're not happy with them between elections. And that is a powerful tool. We have a Taxpayer Protection Act so that now if they want to hike up taxes on us, they're going to have to win a referendum to do it. Good luck. So all of those tools in that toolbox, we're super happy about. Oh, this is the big one. And it's not sexy, but it will save a lot of money in the long run. And it's this. They have a spending rule now that they cannot increase spending year over year higher than the rate of inflation plus population growth. That sounds so wonky and boring, but I went back and did the math and it blew my mind. I had to get other people to check it because I couldn't believe it. So the Taxpayers Federation first started telling the Alberta government, hey folks, keep your spending increases below the rate of inflation plus population. Okay, that's all you need to do. Okay, please do that. Please, please, please. We started telling them that in the 90s, like mid-90s. I went and did the calculation. If the Alberta governments successively had just followed that simple rule, we would have more than $300 billion saved.
Wow.
In cash. I'm not talking about cuts. I'm not talking about resource revenue, no windfall type situation. No, that simple little like pulling back on the reins and keeping your horse's head tucked nice. That's it. 300 billion. So overall, we're happy with what they're doing. However, to your point exactly, we've got some serious red flags here. They are spending too much still, even with that rule, because their debt is going up again, not down. Yeah. And we must have that debt going down. We must, because we are spending close to $3 billion on that per year just in interest. So we're urging them to just be brave, face down some of those government unions, tell them they need to cut the fat out of the middle because we are spending too much on that stuff. And so I'm in the middle of my pre-budget report, actually, where I write it up and I give the recommendations for the Alberta government for their budget. Yeah. And so I'm going through so many departments right now, finding waste and telling them to cut.
All right. Well, much more on all of this. Again, taxpayer.com. Kris, I know it's a busy day, busy week for you, but thanks so much for making some time for us here.
Means a lot to us. Thank you so much for covering it.
Okay, that was Kris Sims, Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Again, taxpayer.com for more on all the issues we discussed there. Coming up in a moment, we're going to hear from Scott Crockatt. He's with the Business Council of Alberta. We're going to talk a bit more about their campaign, an ongoing campaign. It's called A Strong Canada, A Good Life. And they've been touting this and some of the really interesting economic policies, kind of big, bold policy swings they'd like to see the federal government take. And in fairness, I mean, Mark Carney himself has been talking about the need to take big, bold economic swings. We're just kind of waiting to see that. So to keep the pressure on the government to think big, the Business Council of Alberta has some new survey results that show that Canadians also really want to see some bold economic policy and leadership. So we'll find out more about that. Some other issues we'll get to along the way. This is the Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, as we await some further indication from Ottawa as to what kind of bold action they're prepared to take to strengthen and bolster Canada's economy, this really interesting new survey results out today from the Business Council of Alberta showing pretty overwhelming support for bold action. And this is very much in line with what the Business Council has been advocating through their A Strong Canada, A Good Life campaign. So joining us for more, very pleased to welcome to the program here, Scott Crockatt. He is VP of Communications and External Relations at the Business Council of Alberta. Much more, by the way, businesscouncilab.com. Scott, so great to have you with us here.
Rob, thanks for having me on the show.
So let's talk about kind of the message here, because as I say, we're sort of waiting to see which direction the federal government's going to go. And I don't know if there's hesitation, but in terms of whether the public's behind this kind of an approach, it seems pretty clear.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about the context that we're in at the moment. Canadians really want Canada to do better, and they know that Canada needs to do better. The truth is we're in a precarious state. Our economy hasn't been performing very well. We've lost a decade of economic growth. Our standard of living has been declining. And now the world's largest trading relationship between us and the United States, once absolutely rock solid, is much less so. But, as they say, every crisis brings opportunity with it as well. And we think the opportunity here is that this is a chance to do big things that might have been difficult to do otherwise, to get out of our own way in some ways. And so we took, for a number of months, we've been doing what you described, doing some background policy research, producing papers, meeting with decision makers. And then we wanted to take these ideas to Canadians. And so we partnered with Ipsos and we tested 10 really big, bold ideas that the federal government could take on to see what the level of support would be, because we all know that politicians, often follow public support. And the really interesting sort of top line finding was that for all the talk about how divided Canadians are, we're in remarkable alignment about our ambition for the future, what we want to see done. We were seeing strong majorities of Canadians across the country agreeing with ideas like unleashing our natural resources, training people for jobs in the future, and improving our country's competitiveness generally.
Yeah, and I don't know if you would have seen this kind of consensus even just a few years ago. I mean, it sort of speaks to the challenge we face right now, which has really been, I think, illustrated by the trade uncertainty and some of the tariff threats coming from the U.S. I think maybe that's crystallized a lot of this. But where do you think this consensus and this sort of thinking is coming from?
I think in this moment, Canadians are really interested in pulling together. That's one of the things that we're seeing. We're seeing that take place in our sports teams, even how we're cheering for sports, in terms of what we're buying at the grocery store, in terms of how we're thinking about our travel plans. You've probably seen travel numbers are dramatically down compared to the United States. But there's also this just dawning realization, I think, coming to folks across the country that specifically on our economy, that we need to do better, because we need to be stronger and not dependent on decisions that are made in other countries, be that the United States or China or elsewhere. And I was really heartened when I looked at this research. And I'm a bit of a research nerd, Rob, as you probably know. So I dug into the background tables, and these levels of high agreement with ideas like growing jobs and investment in Canada, or making us a top tier technology developer. These held up across regions. They held up across age groups, education levels, even income levels. It moves around a little bit in terms of the level of support, depending on which group you're talking about. But all of those had majority support for these bold concepts. And, we hope the government takes that as a bit of, an impetus to take action on these.
Well, yeah, let's look at some of these. And I mean, the numbers do vary a little bit. I mean, it's all pretty much solid support across the board. But where we see, interestingly, the most support, or the highest level of support, it surrounds the idea of job skills and jobs training. So what would that entail? And why do you think we see such big numbers there?
Well, I think that there is a recognition in Canada that we have some skills mismatches and also some training mismatches in terms of the jobs that we're going to need in the future. And so one really key area that I would point to within that policy idea is actually expanding skills training for the skilled trades. This is an area where there is in very, very high demand, things like heavy duty mechanics, or heavy equipment operators, or airline maintenance people. All of these jobs are just in incredible demand, and we don't have nearly enough of the people to do those. At the same time, these are all sort of high paying jobs and industries, and there's many Canadians that would like to be making a higher wage like that. So I think that's one section, and that's in the trades. And then there's probably another one that we could talk about in the emerging industries, things like AI and high technology, that Canada has a real opportunity. If we train ourselves up, we can get Canadians into these high paying jobs in the future and really get a leg up on, frankly, our competitors around the world.
How does that tie into, and I know, the Business Council of Alberta has talked about focusing our immigration and smarter immigration policy to meet some of these economic needs and especially fill some of those skill gaps. Does that tie together with this?
Absolutely. There's a big need to get our immigration system back functioning correctly. We're hugely supportive of immigration. It's always been an invaluable infusion of energy and brain power into Canada. But the reality is, over the last number of years, it's strayed from its mandate. As a country and a government, the government lost sight of exactly how many folks were coming in certain categories, and frankly, really watered down what was meant by some of those economic categories. So a smaller and smaller percentage of people were coming for, specifically economic reasons. That sort of exact person that we'd like to come from somewhere else in the world who's got a great skill set that we need in Canada. And so what we're advocating for, and what we found has very strong support among Canadians, is for retuning that immigration system back to be more focused on the economy, back to be more focused on the skills and jobs that we need filled, because that's actually what works best for everyone. When the immigration system works really well, when people come here and are very, very successful, that works great for Canada, and it's great for the newcomer as well.
couple others here that stand out. And on the issue of competitiveness, the idea of strengthening Canada's competitiveness, overwhelming support for that. And I mean, that's going to involve trying to make Canada a more attractive jurisdiction for investments, for corporations. But what kind of challenges and hurdles do we face when it comes to improving our competitiveness?
Well, we represent a lot of the largest employers in Alberta, and many of them are the largest companies in Canada. And they would often tell us that competitiveness is their number one or among their number one issues. And what we really mean by that is that Canada's in this global competition for capital, for investment, for projects, and for a whole host of reasons, most of them of our own doing, we have not been that competitive for a while. So what does that look like? Well, they say that the first rule of a hole is when you realize you're in one, stop digging. And so we've been digging ourselves a hole for some time here. We've been layering uncompetitive policies on top of each other that interact in counterproductive ways. And some of those would be the discriminatory emissions caps, like the oil and gas emissions cap, these electricity regulations that are coming through that are just totally unworkable in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and in a couple other provinces. The greenwashing or green hushing, as there's now sort of being called, provisions, and taxes on different kinds of capital deployment. When you stack these things on top of each other, it just ends up being, like a number of walls that any investment has got to try and run through or navigate through. And most of these are not helping our competitiveness and not helping other aspects of Canada that we really want to push forward. And so for the vast majority of the things that I just put out there, our first recommendation would be, immediately withdraw and reverse this stuff that's getting in our own way of being competitive. And what's interesting about the research is this isn't just my opinion or the Business Council of Alberta's opinion. This is the opinion of Canadians. That's one of the things that they're really looking for. 80% of Canadians saying that they'd like to see this focus on competitiveness and getting out of our own way.
Yeah. Of course, speaking of oil and gas, it speaks to the tremendous advantage Canada has with regard to natural resources. Oil and gas is an example. Minerals, the list goes on and on. This is a real strength that we have. And the idea of using that strength to our advantage, really developing natural resources to respond to the moment, that's something else that has a lot of support here.
It certainly does. So, there was about 3/4 of Canadians were supportive of the idea of unleashing our natural resources. And, it's worth mentioning, Rob, that natural resources is the largest industry in Canada. And you listed many of the things that go into that. Oil and gas is the largest component of that. But so mining's very large, forestry is very large, critical minerals fits into that too. And I would argue agriculture is a natural resources industry too in some ways, or at least a dotted line to it. But when you put all that together, that's the largest segment of the Canadian economy. And it's another area where we've been standing in our own way a bit for the last while, or even more than a bit, by just taking far, far too long to develop new natural resources projects. It takes about 20 years to even get a new mine going in Canada. And so there's a broad recognition from Canadians, and I think it's fair to say from policymakers as well, from folks in the federal government, that it just can't take that long to do this, and we need to get out of our own way. And I think framing this as natural resources, these different industries that have different geographic sort of concentrations across the country, allows us as Canadians to say, well, hey, BC is going to do probably more forestry, and Alberta and Saskatchewan are going to be more involved in the energy business, and Central Canada has a real strength in mining. But collectively, we're going to be a country that tries to take advantage of our natural resources. It is a huge opportunity because, if you look at it, if you were playing a game, Canada would be almost like cheating. We've got all the water, all the trees, all the energy, all the critical minerals, all the food, all the uranium, all the potash that you could pretty much ever need. We just need to unleash the potential of that industry.
Right. I think even for Albertans, it's encouraging. And I know from an Alberta perspective, this is an area of priority. And you expect to see high levels of support in Alberta for this approach. But to see that across the country, to see that other Canadians support this kind of approach when it comes to natural resources, that there's some, Canadian consensus, I think that's got to be encouraging from an Alberta perspective.
It certainly is. And I'll tell you one aspect of that, because I zoomed right in on that and looking across the country on what's the level of support for unleashing natural resources. And, that it's in the 70s across Canada, 69% in Atlantic Canada, so just a tiny bit below that. But really interesting from an Alberta perspective is I zoomed right in on Quebec. And 70% of Quebecers agree with this idea of unleashing Canada's natural resources sector. And so I think one of the most important things to take away from this is at times in the past, we sometimes feel like there's strong differences of opinion across our country, and there are strong differences of opinion on certain things. But what brings us together is much more than what divides us, particularly in this moment.
So we'll see. I mean, the government has certainly set the table legislatively through Bill C-5 as an example, but even just in what we've heard from the Prime Minister and other ministers, that now is the time for bold action and big swings. So do you remain optimistic that we are going to see that follow through?
Yeah, I'm incredibly optimistic that we could see some bold action during this time. And I think that's for a bunch of reasons. Some of them you just said. The early actions of the federal government have indicated that they're interested in this kind of bold action, that they want to move quickly. The folks that I talk to regularly understand the challenges that are in front of us and are interested in bold ideas. I think across the provinces, you're seeing a lot of alignment among premiers of various political stripes with the idea that we got to get our economy moving, get major projects built, unleash our natural resources. You're seeing that from premiers of all political stripes. And then I think that this information that we're getting, this polling result and the attitudes of Canadians, that's the icing on top of the cake that makes me optimistic for change. Because when politicians see that strong majorities of their constituents, strong majorities of Canadians are very enthusiastic about these ideas, that gives them the license to move quickly and move boldly. And that's why we were so excited to put this out to the world.
Much more on these survey results, much more as well on the campaign. It's businesscouncilab.com. Scott, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate this.
Thanks very much, Rob.
Okay, once again, that was Scott Crockatt. He is VP of Communications and External Relations at the Business Council of Alberta, businesscouncilab.com. Now, for what it's worth, the Prime Minister himself, Mark Carney, published this little video of himself on social media on Thursday. Again, and I think this plays into these expectations people now have that, okay, let's see these big, bold new policies. Let's see projects. Let's see things start to happen. And so here was the Prime Minister, again, posting a video of himself talking about just that.
C5 has the potential, as I say, to unleash enormous possibilities, to build big things, ports, trade corridors, energy infrastructure, to help develop our natural resources, our critical minerals, help develop our people in ways that connect and transform our economy. Part of, at the core of this act is changing how the federal government operates. One aspect of that is moving from a position when we see a new project from asking the question why to asking the question how. How can we build?
Right. Well, yeah, it all sounds well and good. I know things can't just happen overnight, but, we're getting on some months now from when we've been hearing this rhetoric or even since we've seen Bill C-5 pass. So hopefully that starts to translate into action soon. Listen, before we wrap up this episode of the podcast, a few other news stories I did want to get to. It's actually been a very interesting and eventful week, and a few updates on some stories we've been talking about in recent episodes of this podcast. So we will do all of that in our final segment here. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Thanks for being with us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. As mentioned, a few stories I want to run through here, and these are stories that we've been talking about on this podcast. I think these are significant and ongoing stories, so I did want to get to the latest on a few fronts here. Number one concerns the question of whether or when Albertans are going to be voting in a referendum on Alberta's future in Confederation. Now, recently we spoke with former MLA Thomas Lukaszuk. He's with the group Forever Canadian. They're officially off and running with their petition. Now, of course, they want to keep Alberta in Canada. The chief electoral officer has approved their petition, but they're under the old rules. So they got to collect just under 300,000 signatures by the end of October. So that's a tall order indeed, but they are off and running. Now, theirs is not a constitutional question, whereas the petition that was submitted by the Alberta Prosperity Project, the separatist group, is a constitutional question. And so under the Alberta government's own legislation, regarding referendums, an unconstitutional question cannot be put to a referendum. So it gives the chief electoral officer some discretion in getting feedback or basically asking a judge whether a certain question is constitutional. So because the Alberta Prosperity Project's question is of a constitutional nature, the Chief Electoral Officer has referred the matter to a judge. Now, one of the arguments being heard last week was for the judge to just wash his hands of this. The Alberta Prosperity Project just wanted the judge to say, no, I'm not getting involved. Just go ahead and proceed. So fast forward to this week. On Thursday, Court of King's Bench Justice Colin Feasby says, yes, he is going to examine the constitutionality of this question. There will be a full hearing on the matter. So that's not to say which way he's going to rule or decide in the end, but he does believe that it's worthwhile to explore this issue. So the application to quash the review has been rejected, which simply means that it will go ahead with the assessment. And it is an important matter. And again, the legislation does allow for this path to deal with any of these potential issues. Now, the other thing that came up last week was that the Alberta government, both the Premier and the Justice Minister, said they didn't want the Chief Electoral Officer making this reference, which was a little weird because they're the ones who put that in the legislation, and it's a little bit inappropriate to be interfering in all of this. So anyway, it seems like a bit of a moot point now because it's not just the Chief Electoral Officer saying maybe this needs some judicial assessment. It's now this Court of King's Bench judge, Colin Feasby. So he's going to have a hearing on the matter, but that's not going to happen for a while. So that's the other element in all of this, the delay that this causes in ruling on whether this petition can proceed. But this is some of what the judge had to say in court on Thursday. Like, for example, quote, process under the Citizen Initiative Act fosters the condition for the clear expression of the will of the population of the province by dispelling the cloud of unconstitutionality that might otherwise hang over a referendum unknown. The referral to the court may result in delay, but it reinforces the legitimacy of the referendum process by ensuring that unconstitutional questions are not put to a vote. The citizens of Alberta deserve to have these arguments made properly and heard in full. Democracy demands nothing less. So November 17th is when this matter is set to return to court. Sounds like it'll be a week-long hearing, but it could still be another month or so before an actual ruling comes down. So that puts us right at the end of 2025. And then if this petition is going to proceed, now we're into 2026. Now, in the meantime, this all happens after the deadline that's in place for the group Forever Canadian and their petition effort. So if they get enough petition signatures to force a referendum, then this is all a moot point because there can't be two separate referendums on basically the same issue or the same question. And that's kind of what Forever Canadian was hoping to do in the first place, was to beat the separatists to the punch, kind of flip the question on its head and prevail that way. So a few things to be watching for there. I mean, A, whether Forever Canadian can reach that petition threshold by the end of October. And then, of course, looking to November, and whenever this decision comes down, whether this petition from the Alberta Prosperity Project can proceed. So significant development in court in Alberta on Thursday, that there will be a hearing to decide on the constitutionality of the question that the Alberta Prosperity Project wishes to ask. Okay, so on to item number 2, which is kind of a few different issues, but under the umbrella, I guess, of Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who was speaking Thursday in Saskatchewan just ahead of this by-election he faces back here in Alberta on Monday in Battle River Crowfoot. Now, one of the questions for Pierre Poilievre, as he was talking about a few other things, was about the by-election. There was a report out this week suggesting that his showing could affect how things go for him in the leadership review, which is coming up in a few months. I think everybody expects that Pierre Poilievre is going to win this by-election, but the challenge for him in this seat, which was certainly seen as a very safe Conservative seat, is just how safe it was in the last election. Damien Curak, who won for the Conservatives, had about 83% of the votes in April. So what happens if Pierre Poilievre gets less than that, which I don't know. I mean, it kind of looks like he probably will. I don't know by how much. So there's some pressure, according to this report, some pressure on Pierre Poilievre to match that 83% vote share. And if he doesn't, could that pose a problem for him? Here's what he said when he was asked about it.
Can you stay on as leader if you win the by-election with less of a vote share than former MP Damien Curak?
Well, listen, we're going to continue to work hard through to Monday. And the people of Battle River Crowfoot are going to decide whether they want strong national leadership for the local issues that affect their lives. It's going to take national leadership to reverse Carney's ban on your gas truck or car. National leadership to defend our hunters and sport shooters' right to keep their property. National leadership to get pipelines built so that communities like Hardisty and all of the smaller communities who rely on oil and gas jobs can come roaring back to life. National leadership to stand up for our farmers, and I'm encouraging people to vote to advance their local issues by having a strong national voice in the forthcoming by-election. It would be a privilege to champion the people who feed, power, and protect our country from Battle River Crowfoot.
Okay, and here's part of why Pierre Poilievre was speaking on Thursday to make an announcement targeting what I think remains an unpopular Liberal policy, an unpopular Justin Trudeau policy that Mark Carney hasn't yet discarded, but maybe some indication that he could or might or maybe will, and it concerns the government's electric vehicle or zero-emission vehicle mandate, that 100% of new vehicles sold by 2035 will have to be zero-emission, but already next year for 2026, which isn't that far away, we start off with a 20% target. So there's also a new poll up this week, again, showing that this is not a popular policy. And so the Conservatives are seizing on that. They say they're going to launch a campaign this fall, both in Parliament and outside of Parliament through other means, to put some pressure on the government to scrap this EV mandate. Here's what Pierre Poilievre said about it on Thursday.
In just a few months, on January 1st, the Carney mandate, the Carney ban on your gas vehicle will begin to be phased in. It will require 20% of dealership sales to be electric, and any car sold above that quota will pay a $20,000 tax. I call it the Carney tax. The Liberals' mandate would continue to worsen as years go by until 2035, when gas vehicles would be banned altogether. The auto industry is already under enormous stress after Mark Carney broke his promise to get a July 21st, 2025 deal with to end the tariffs imposed by the United States. The last thing they need is a job-killing, price-hiking gas vehicle ban. The CAA found that all electric vehicles can lose 40% of their power during cold winters. EVs that are comparable in utility and function to their gas-powered vehicles on average cost about $20,000 more. Consumers should be free to choose the car or truck that they drive. They should be able to decide for themselves what they buy and how they get around. And yet we know that Mark Carney's plan will punish them for making those choices, and according to the Canadian Journal of Economics, kill 38,000 jobs across this country. That is why I am announcing today that Conservatives are launching a massive nationwide campaign to stop Mark Carney's ban on gas-powered vehicles. This campaign will include motions in Parliament, pressure campaigns in local Liberal MP ridings, press conferences and events at car dealerships across Canada, petitions, and other activities that will mobilize Canadians to maintain their right to decide what car they can afford and what car works for them. It's time to put Canadians back in the driver's seat so that they can decide what life they want to live.
Okay, and somewhat related to the EV issue is what's happened now this week. China imposing stiff new tariffs on Canadian canola exports. Now, Canada exports a lot of canola to China. And in some ways, China's kind of shooting themselves in the foot here because they rely so heavily on Canada for canola, but they're making it more expensive. But this is also going to be bad news for Canadian producers, Canadian farmers, which are primarily out here in the West on the prairies. And I think there's some frustration maybe that this hasn't received the same level of attention as other tariffs that have been applied to other sectors of the Canadian economy, like, for example, the automotive sector. But of course, Canada has put pretty stiff tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, and that's where there's a connection here. Between what we're doing to protect the auto industry in Canada by keeping out Chinese EV competition and the way China is now responding by going after our agriculture sector. So here's what the Conservative leader said about that on Thursday.
Well, first of all, let's recognize that China's tariffs on our canola producers are totally unjustified. They had already targeted our beef producers before there were any electric vehicle tariffs imposed on them. So the Chinese government has mistreated our economy for many years. I believe the first thing we should do is cancel the billion-dollar federal loan that Mark Carney is extending to BC Ferries to have them buy Chinese ships. Mark Carney is giving $1 billion of shipbuilding contracts through a taxpayer-funded loan to the Chinese government and the Chinese economy. That is crazy. At a time when they're targeting our farmers, I think we should look at ways we can penalize the regime in Beijing for targeting our farmers. I mean, so far, Mark Carney has said nothing about the canola producers, like he doesn't care about Western Canadian producers. You know, I had my team check his Twitter account. He hasn't tweeted a single thing about canola, yet he's been able to tweet about International Cat Day. So isn't that nice? You know, we need a prime minister who will actually stand up for all Canadians, including and especially our prairie producers. Thank you.
Okay, and I should point out that after Pierre Poilievre was speaking later on Thursday, the prime minister did take to social media to comment on this whole situation. He says, quote, "I spoke yesterday with Premier Scott Moe about China's preliminary anti-dumping duties on Canadian canola seed. If maintained, these unjustified duties will have significant impacts on many Canadian farmers. Premier Moe and I focused on a series of measures to support hardworking farmers who provide world-class food to Canadians and our trading partners throughout the world. The Premier and I agreed to engage directly with industry leaders in the near term to discuss the options and build on yesterday's meetings of Canada's Minister of Agriculture and Minister of International Trade with many of our leading canola producers and exporters. Canada does not dump canola. Canadian canola producers meet the highest standards. Our inspection systems are robust. We will advance a constructive dialogue with Chinese officials to address our respective trade concerns while diversifying our trade abroad and supporting our canola producers at home." So the government's in a bit of a bind here. There is the whole EV question. Do we ease up on tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles? And if we allow more of those in, which would give Canadians a cheaper option if they really want us to meet this mandate, what does that do to the Canadian companies that have received some pretty substantial subsidies to increase production of electric vehicles or EV batteries? But then there's the question of the U.S. and how the U.S. views China. I mean, initially, China was seen as a trade threat, almost a national security threat. So it made sense for Canada to stand with the United States. But is Trump now looking to get friendlier with China and make a deal with China? And if so, do we need to do the same? So it'll be tough to see how we get out of this or what we can possibly do to respond. Do we retaliate against China? Do we say, okay, fine, we'll make nice with China? The U.S. certainly isn't helping us, and I know that's the other concern with all kinds of sectors, agriculture included, is what the Americans are ultimately going to do in terms of tariff and how that impacts trade north-south. There's a lot of agricultural trade that goes back and forth over the Canada-U.S. border. So it's good to see the Prime Minister address this, at least, because it does feel like this hasn't mattered as much when it's tariffs on vehicles or tariffs on steel. You know, the Prime Minister is quick to respond, but tariffs on canola didn't seem to warrant the same attention, even though it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So there's a response from the Prime Minister, doesn't necessarily tell us what the next steps will be, but he did address it. Okay, and finally, item number 3 concerns wildfires. It's been another bad year for wildfires in many parts of the country, and that includes Atlantic Canada. Now, earlier in the week, we spoke with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which was pushing back against Nova Scotia's policy, and I guess soon after New Brunswick followed suit, a policy that forbids anybody from even entering the woods or the forest at all, like camping or just walking on a trail. Because of the dry conditions and the fire risk, those provinces have decided that's off limits. Like in Nova Scotia, for example, the fine for violating that ban is $25,000. So it's prompted quite a debate about whether that's an overreach or an overreaction on Nova Scotia's part, and by extension, I guess, New Brunswick. So like I say, a lot of debate about that this week. A couple of things I did want to mention. Now, since we had the conversation, there was a fire that broke out around Halifax. And so I think some defenders of the policy were saying, well, see, here's the concern. And again, I think the concern's legitimate. I don't think there's a sinister hidden agenda going on here. But it's just a question of whether, things like walking on trails, whether that poses any kind of a fire risk. And I guess that depends on what people are doing. But the thing with this fire that broke out near Halifax is that according to authorities, it was actually right on the edge of a business park in Halifax. And it was an open fire that had been set there. Now, there was some reports that maybe that was connected to some kind of homeless encampment. Authorities hadn't confirmed that, but it does appear as though this was not somebody walking on a trail or being in the woods. It was actually in a business park just west of downtown Halifax, and it was resulting from a fire that authorities say was caused by human activity. Yeah, it underscores the risk of that kind of thing, and having things like fire bans, etc., makes sense. So I think, it's still a fair question to say, is banning people from trails or forests or woods altogether, is that reasonable? And just one other aspect to that debate, because as mentioned, Nova Scotia went ahead and did this first. New Brunswick has followed suit. But Newfoundland, which is also dealing with a serious wildfire threat, they've opted not to go with this approach. They still got bans on fires and different kinds of restrictions in place to try to deal with the fire threat, but they haven't taken this course of action. So Newfoundland's premier was asked about it earlier this week. John Hogan is his name. So here's what Premier Hogan had to say when he was asked why they weren't emulating what Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are doing.
Any plan to ban people from hiking, camping like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have, given that?
Look, it's very difficult to do that here in Newfoundland and Labrador. I mean, people literally go back and forth to their daily activities and lives and to work on ATVs. People literally do live in wooded areas, so I don't know how you ban people from their homes. That's just going to compound the problem in terms of evacuating people who live in or near woods. We felt that taking the steps with the fines will put pressure on people to be careful and to not abuse the privileges that we have in this society. So that's where we are right now.
Is that enough pressure right now?
I think it's the right thing to do right now, and we need to continue to make sure we do everything we can to get the message out there. And I don't know if extra fires popping up in the St. John's area will send a louder message and a clear message, and I certainly hope it does. Again, we're talking about an extremely small percentage of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, not 99.99% or more understand, follow the rules when the fines were $75, let alone when they're $50,000. So we are targeting that very extreme small percentage of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians that may be breaking the Forestry Act regulations.
Okay, so you go. I think that's an interesting answer from John Hogan, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, as to how they're approaching this. And as he says, they're dealing with some issues or circumstances that are specific to their province. And so Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, they've opted to go in a different direction. I think there's some fair criticisms to be made of those provinces and how they've handled this. It seems like a bit of an overreach on my part, but I get that they're dealing with a really serious situation there. In terms of these dry conditions, in terms of the fire threat, in terms of the resources they have available. So there's been quite a debate. I think there are people who have made some interesting and good points about why these provinces feel like they have to do this. So I suspect that debate will continue. But in the meantime, the fire threat itself does continue. And let's certainly hope for the best out there. Listen, that's where we're going to leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. We will be back on Tuesday with a new episode for you. Also, watch for next week on Wednesday, a new episode of The Line Alberta. alberta.readtheline.ca. And of course, you can find me on my Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca. That's where this podcast is hosted. You can also read more commentary on the website. We have a piece up on some of these issues around transparency and access to information in Alberta that we talked about earlier in the program. We got a piece up at robbreakenridge.ca. You can find this podcast on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and other podcast platforms. So have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We'll talk to you next week. Take care.